Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my 2020 comeback players of the year. We're going to be talking about 3 wide receivers who, in my opinion, due to the various circumstances they faced in 2019, struggled heavily. And sure, that may be the case, but in 2020, we have a brand new season. The slate needs to be wiped clean. A lot of people are correlating guys like Odell Beckham Jr., Brandin Cooks, and Juju Smith-Schuster with their 2019 performances as if that's the end-all be-all of what they're capable of in 2020. And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. I understand that there's multiple arguments on both sides, whether it's pro or against guys like Odell Beckham Jr., but we have to evaluate the pros and cons of potentially drafting them in 2020 to understand their true value. Again, there's always going to be an argument for and against these players, but that's what we're going to go over today. I'm going to talk about why I believe these 3 wide receivers have a great opportunity to be comeback players and be drafted in your drafts at a very cheap value in terms of their current stock. Now, before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, for those of you who are new to the channel, make sure you click the subscribe button, join the community. We'll be creating fantasy football content here for the entirety of the 2020 season. Again, there's going to be videos coming up real soon that a lot of you are going to be interested in terms of strength of schedule, tier-based rankings. All of that will be coming down the pike. Also, don't forget Kiorkof's 2020 Fantasy Football Draft Guide is now available. For those of you looking to find information on that, go down in the description of the video. You can find my Patreon down there where I have a video connected to everything talking about what's going to be inside the draft guide and everything I produce outside of the channel here itself, and in the website where you can also find Kiorkof's Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Now, let's talk about these players because, again, I am excited and I am passionate about the potential of these 3 guys going into 2020. Now, of course, Odell Beckham Jr. is one of the most volatile players in terms of what people's opinion of him are. I understand he's a flashy player and he did not produce in 2019 and he's been hurt for the last couple seasons, but he is still one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, and that cannot be disputed. The statistics that he's put up throughout his short career are unbelievable, and sure, he may have been in a circumstance last year that wasn't beneficial for him. And though many of us anticipated Odell Beckham Jr. to have an incredible 2019 year, fact that he got traded to a better offense, quote unquote, Freddie Kitchens was not able to get that off the floor. And Odell Beckham Jr., as much as he tried, was not able to find a consistency with Baker Mayfield, which I think in 2020 will be found. Kind of put it in perspective just how good Odell Beckham has been. Let's not forget that this guy's been in the league since 2014. And in 2014, he was the number 6 overall wide receiver in half PPR. Then following season, he finished as the number 5 overall wide receiver in half PPR. And in the following season after that, he finished as the number 4 wide receiver. I mean, sure, in 2017, he was injured for the majority of the season. We don't really count that. It happens. Players will get injured without, anything in advance. Just happens. That's the nature of the sport. But in 2018, even with the fact that he missed the last month of the season with a hamstring injury, he had still finished the first 12 weeks of the season as the number 16 he had finished it as a wide receiver 1, but he had finished the entire season as the number 16 wide receiver. If he had stayed healthy, easily would have been a wide receiver 1. And then we go into 2019, where sure, he had 133 targets, 74 receptions for 1,035 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, and only 164.3 fantasy points. And sure, he only finished as the number 26 wide receiver, but we have to take into account that that is going to be the worst performance in Odell Beckham's career going forward. Unless we're going to end up seeing Odell Beckham completely fall off, which I 100% don't believe is the case, there is a strong argument that that is going to be his worst performance of his career, and that is going to be behind him as we surpass that going into 2020. Because again, if that's the worst that we're going to see of him, that's the best that we get out of a lot of players. And what we continue to anticipate out of Odell Beckham, and where I continue to see him come off draft boards, you could potentially get a guy that is easily going to be in the conversation of a top 16 wide receiver with upside for a far lower price in terms of you can get him potentially as a low-end wide receiver 2 in the 5th or 6th round at times. I've seen it, trust me. It's kind of crazy where Odell Beckham's coming off the board, but let's take into account what he was capable of producing last year with the opportunity that he was given. If he can go ahead and replicate that this year with a better offense in terms of the offensive line producing, you have a brand new left tackle, brand new right tackle. It's going to protect their quarterback and their blue chip quarterback of the future to allow Odell Beckham to have deeper routes, to allow him to produce more on the field. Because if the quarterback's comfortable, he's going to get the ball there accurately, which wasn't the case last year. I mean, again, only 74 receptions on 133 targets. That's a 55.64 catch rate. Sure, Odell Beckham didn't come off the field last year. He was one of the players that, like a quarterback, never was off the field. He played 95.42% of the snap share of that Cleveland Browns offense. And on top of it, sure, he didn't produce what we all expected him to. But I really do think that he's in line in terms of opportunity to produce those numbers as a top 16 wide receiver. I mean, out of all the top 24 wide receivers last season, only 2 of them did not surpass 110 targets. The 2 wide receivers that didn't make the top 24 wide receivers last season that did have over 110 targets are Odell Beckham Jr. and Jamison Crowder, 2 guys that have incredible opportunity. And why I always continue to harp on Jamison Crowder is because he's given consistent targets, and opportunity will always lead to success in fantasy football. And that stands true with a guy like Odell Beckham Jr. Sure, 133 targets wasn't nearly as close to what he was getting in New York. I mean, when we look at what he was averaging with the New York Giants, I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. 10.5 targets per game, 6.6 receptions per game, 93 receiving yards per game, 0.75 touchdowns per game for a 17.1 fantasy point per game average as a New York Giant. Sure, those numbers are incredible. Odell Beckham Jr. produced stats that a lot of people really won't be able to recreate in the future of the sport. And hopefully there will be players that come and produce those numbers. But I really do think Odell Beckham has kind of solidified himself as one of these best wide receivers in the league because of what he's capable and what his ceiling is and what he's already produced. I mean, last year, sure, he only averaged 10.27 fantasy points per game, but in the 8 games where he was given 8+ targets, he was already averaging 12.7 fantasy points. That's a great line there. And sure, there's going to be an opportunity where the games that he just wasn't targeted often, he's not going to get the opportunity. I mean, last season had 8 games of over 10 fantasy points and 8 games of below 10 fantasy points. That's just the inconsistency of targets that he continued to see and inconsistency of play at the quarterback position. Now, I do believe, I'm one of the believers that, you know, a guy like Baker Mayfield can improve. And sure, his accuracy and his credibility is a little bit on the line this upcoming season. But Odell Beckham Jr. shouldn't be at fault for what the heck happened last year. I mean, of the 74 receptions last season, that's not a great number. It definitely could have been increased, but he only had 81 deemed catchable passes last year. He dropped a couple here and there, but to be honest, the fact that he's getting about 50 of his targets thrown 10 yards above him into the ground, into a defender's hands. Again, when Baker Mayfield targeted Odell Beckham Jr. last season, 7 of those targets led to interceptions. There was a lot of play from Baker Mayfield that just did not work properly. And I do think that with more experience and with them at least building a chemistry this offseason and last season, there's going to be more opportunity for Odell Beckham to produce. Because again, despite the fact that he had 133 targets, his target share and rate was not bad. He ran 572 total routes, 23.25% target rate with a 1.81 yards per route run. Not bad at all. On top of it, he had the second most deep pass targets. Those are targets of 20+ yards. He had 33 of those. Only 8 were caught because only 10 were catchable last season. If these numbers continue to go in the right direction, if Baker Mayfield can produce the way we anticipate him to, because everyone is around him in this offense and on this team are improving. You're getting pieces. You're bringing in Austin Hoopers. You're bringing in offensive tackles that are going to protect him. If you can make your quarterback comfortable, it's going to lead to the success of everyone around him. And Odell Beckham is the number 1 guy that, in my opinion, has the biggest floor of opportunity to make a positive jump in terms of fantasy production. I mean, Nick Chubb's productivity last year is not going to be increased by any, stretch of the imagination. Sure, he might produce similar numbers, might get more touchdowns, but the opportunity was there in itself and the production was there. That number can't increase any farther. I mean, sure, 1,500 yards, you can go to 1,800 rushing yards, but stuff like that is very difficult to produce in comparison to a guy like Odell Beckham Jr., who only had 11 red zone targets last year that led to 1 receiving touchdown. Those numbers can easily increase and produce, substantial fantasy numbers that will make a difference in the long run. And when we talk about this Browns offense, sure, Baker Mayfield is known as one of the fringe players at this moment in time. Got to take into account this offense ran the 3rd most play action passing attempts last year, in which Baker Mayfield found the most success there. I mean, his 66.5% passing completion percentage out of play action plays is something that he likes to do. Also, he threw the 5th most deep passes last year. These are 2 things that they like to do: play action and deep passes. And when this offense is going to be barreling down on defenders in terms of their offensive line play and their running backs, 2 of the best running backs in the league, you got yourself a really good opportunity with Odell Beckham. That's just the argument that I make. And I understand there's going to be a lot of people and there could be a lot of arguments made against him. But at this current juncture, I really do think that Odell Beckham is in line for a better overall season in terms of his productivity, in terms of his opportunity. All of it is going to connect, and I think, Kevin Stefanski coming into this offense, what he was able to produce with only a guy like Stephon Diggs last year, wide receiver. As soon as Adam Thielen was there and Stephon Diggs were there, they were both playing well. But if you can go ahead and put them both, put two receivers like a Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham on the field, this offense gets even more deadly and more viable, in my opinion. Either way, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about our next wide receiver. Let's talk about a guy like Brandin Cooks, who in my opinion is being extremely undervalued once again because of what he produced in 2019. Now I understand 72 targets, 42 receptions, 583 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 96.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. That's not great, especially considering what he's produced in the past couple seasons. If we go back to 2015, he was the number 14 wide receiver. In 2016, he was the number 9 wide receiver at the end of the season. In 2017, he was the number 12 wide receiver. And in 2018, he was the number 13 wide receiver. In the past 4 seasons prior to 2019, so from 2015 to 2018, Brandin Cooks produced 4 1,000-yard receiving seasons. He produced, wide receiver 1, 2 numbers. The lowest he ever was wide receiver number 14 in a season. Brandin Cooks is an extremely talented wide receiver. And now that he's moving into the organization where they need a number 1 wide receiver, they just traded away DeAndre Hopkins in Houston. Deshaun Watson needs a number 1 guy, and I think that's why they went and got Brandin Cooks. And I think that's what he's going to be for this team. So before we get into that and my potential for Brandin Cooks going into 2020, I want to talk about where everything went wrong with the Los Angeles Rams. Again, I'm a Rams fan, and I can definitely see exactly where everything kind of fell off, where the wheels fell off this truck for Brandin Cooks' career in LA. So prior to him getting injured last season, he played 86% of the snap share. After, he had about a pretty big decline. It went to 63.55% snap share, which was a 22.97% decline. All in all, not a great number. But in weeks 1 through 7, where he was playing majority of the time, he averaged 9.25 fantasy points per game, was the number 29 wide receiver. Sure, he was a top 36 guy. Not terrible, but the big difference maker was, in comparison to the year before, there was no Cooper Kupp running all over the place, catching passes. Cooper Kupp was injured with that ACL injury, which really gave Brandin Cooks the opportunity to be the number 2 wide receiver. But as soon as Cooper Kupp was back, Robert Woods still there. Those are the number 1 and 2 receiving options. Again, those 2 guys had over 130 targets last year for a reason. Now, the fact that Brandin Cooks gets injured, he comes back, and then Tyler Higbee steps up as the number 3 wide receiver of this offense. That's where it all went wrong. And they were already preparing at that point to trade Brandin Cooks with an extremely expensive contract. They were looking to try to move away from him, try to build more of an offense that you use a tight end in, and not have to rely upon 3 wide receivers in every offensive set. So that's what they did. They traded him away. And sure, last season, it just nothing statistically favored Brandin Cooks. Even in the 452 routes that he ran, he was only targeted 72 times, which is a 15.93% target rate. Terrible number. He had 17 deep pass targets. Great number. In terms of the NFL, it was like top 20. That's not a bad number. But that's where Brandin Cooks succeeds. You need to get him more opportunities there. On top of it, last season, only 5 red zone targets for 2 receiving touchdowns. Again, I know he's a deep passing player, but when you get down in the red zone, if he's not a threat, then who is? It was Cooper Kupp and it was Tyler Higbee, who were really, and obviously a guy like Todd Gurley, who was racking a lot of touchdowns. But Brandin Cooks just had to play second, third, fourth, fifth fiddle in this offense when they got down in the red zone, which obviously hurt when he only had 2 total touchdowns last year. But I really do think now that he is the potential number 1 wide receiver of the Houston Texans, we go back from 2015 to 2018 and we saw what he was capable of. He averaged 119 targets a year, 77 receptions a year, 1,149 receiving yards a year, 7 receiving touchdowns, and 202.7 fantasy points per game in that 4-year stretch. And that's the fact of the matter is, he's produced these numbers on 3 different teams, with the Saints, with the New England Patriots, and the Rams. And now that he goes to his 4th team, I don't think it's going to be hard for Brandin Cooks to adjust and find himself going into this Houston Texans offense. In my opinion, and I always say this, the best ability in the NFL is availability. And sure, He missed 2 games in 2019, but in the 4 years prior, he didn't miss a single game during the regular season, and he was consistently producing for these teams. And when we look at the Houston Texans offense, outside of DeAndre Hopkins, no wide receiver in the past 4 years has had a 16-game season. Even DeAndre Hopkins misses week 17s, but that doesn't really count. Outside of him, nobody else. Will Fuller always injured. Kenny Stills missing games. Randall Cobb has been injured in the past, even though he joins this team, is not going to be a guy that is on a weekly basis getting himself wide receiver one attention to where he's being, triple covered or has to be the go-to guy. I really do think, Will Fuller, yikes. I really do think that now that Brandin Cooks is going to be potentially the number one guy here, with Watson's ability, he's going to be the number one target. And at his current rate, at where he's going in drafts, it's extremely undervalued. And the comeback season is just upon the way. I mean, when we look at what Watson did last season, he had the 7th most deep passing attempts amongst all quarterbacks last season. He had the highest deep pass accuracy in the league last year. He was one of only 6 quarterbacks that threw for over 1,000 yards in the deep passing game. And if, in fact, Will Fuller had not dropped so many touchdowns in the deep passing game, he dropped 3 deep passes against the Kansas City Chiefs last year. That's an extra 3 touchdowns. If that had not happened, and 7 of I think it was 77 total deep passing attempts of Deshaun Watson were caught and not dropped, he would have had a 54% completion percentage on deep passes, which would have led the league last year. All in all, Deshaun Watson is a great deep passing quarterback. He's a guy that needs a number one wide receiver, and I think he'll find that this upcoming season in Brandin Cooks. And I don't really think, Brandin Cooks is really being looked at, and you really get him late as your bench wide receiver. Let's move on to the last wide receiver I wanted to mention, Juju Smith-Schuster. Again, Juju did not have a great 2019 season. Everything went wrong, starting with Big Ben getting injured and then him getting injured. He only produced 70 targets, 42 receptions, 552 total receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 92.2 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. When we think about what Juju Smith-Schuster is capable of, we know what it is. 2017, his rookie season, finishes the number 16 wide receiver. Incredible. In 2018, with Antonio Brown, and what Antonio Brown did in 2018, whether it was 15 touchdowns, 169 targets, over 100 receptions, over 1,100 receiving yards, Juju Smith-Schuster still finished as the number 9 wide receiver in the National Football League because of what that offense was capable of doing and what they were continuously producing on a weekly basis. Ben Roethlisberger broke records for the Steelers in terms of passing completions, attempts, yards, everything. 2018 was an incredible year for the Steelers. And it seems to me that a lot of people are forgetting what Juju Smith-Schuster is capable of. And I understand he's going to now be the number 1 wide receiver, but this is a very versatile guy that can be moved everywhere around the formation, whether it's out wide or in the slot position. Juju has produced, and he's one of these guys that, in my opinion, looking at last year, everything went wrong. And I only think it can only go up from here on out. The quarterback play even last year was at very best average. And even then, it's hard to think that the Steelers were still capable of winning 8 games last year with Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph as their starting quarterbacks. Imagine when you bring Big Ben back into this situation with a more improved offensive line, you have more experience at the wide receiver position, and then you bring in more talent at running back through this draft. You have yourself a situation where Big Ben is probably in one of the better offenses that he's had, and I understand there's no AB, but Juju Smith-Schuster can play that role. Last season, he only had 18.32% target rate within the offense. But at least in the games that he was actually given an ample opportunity, the 5 games he had 7+ targets, he averaged 14.22 fantasy points per game. Not a bad number. Let's not forget that in 2018, Juju Smith-Schuster was a monster. 166 targets, 111 receptions, 1,426 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, again, for 241.4 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Just looking back at those numbers in 2018, he had 13 games of 8+ targets. Again, like I just mentioned, he only had 5 games of 7+ targets last year. In 2 of the games in 2018, Juju Smith-Schuster had 19 and 17 targets. Those 2 target games alone from 2018 would have accounted for nearly 50% of his total target rate from this past season. That's 36 total targets. That's unbelievable. All in all, Ben Roethlisberger being brought back into this offense is going to make the Steelers a passing team. We always think, they're going to run the ball. Dude, the Steelers have been a pass-heavy team for quite some time now. And really running the ball has not been too big of a deal since A guy like Le'Veon Bell has left the building. Sure, Le'Veon Bell was getting about 300 rushing attempts per game, but in comparison, they've always been a team that passed the ball more on a yearly basis, and that's undoubtable. I think going into 2020, the fact that this guy can get work in the slot, I mean, even last year, 38 targets from the slot, 25 receptions, 316 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. And then the fact that he's a deep ball wide receiver, again, in 20 almost dropped it. I mean, I'm getting a little passionate here. In 2018, he had 18 plus targets of 20 plus yards. That's ridiculous. That in itself, incredible number. In his rookie year, his sophomore year, he had receptions of 97 yards. He's always been a deep pass guy. He's got a big body. I really do think in one-on-one, coverage on the outside, he's going to be able to make plays. And when we look back at 2018, what he was able to do, 26 total targets, second most in the National Football League in the red zone in 2018. I mean, 26 targets in comparison to this last year, a world's difference. I mean, that led to 14 receptions and 5 receiving touchdowns. Again, all in tandem with the fact that AB was scoring 15 touchdowns that year. There is a huge upside for Juju Smith-Schuster, and I think a lot of people are forgetting about that. And I think a lot of people are forgetting about these 3 wide receivers, and that's why I wanted to talk about them. Again, guys that have been top 12 wide receivers in the last couple of years that sure had tough 2019s, and you could bring in the conversation of, hey, Adam Thielen, he's another one of these guys. But in my opinion, I think a lot of people are paying him more respect this upcoming season in comparison to these other guys. Because, the quarterback situation in that offense and the fact that they lose, Stephon Diggs. But all in all, I do have a lot of confidence in these 3 wide receivers. I understand the arguments against them. OBJ, if in fact, Baker Mayfield does not improve, you're going to have a problem there. If this team wants to run the ball as heavily as they've shown in the past, that's going to also be a problem. With bringing in Austin Hooper and having Kareem Hunt for a whole year, is that going to hurt the production of an Odell Beckham in terms of targets and opportunity? I see the arguments. I 100% believe that they are present. Even with Brandin Cooks' sake. I mean, Brandin Cooks doesn't have to be the number 1 wide receiver there. There could be, Will Fuller coming out and having a 16-game season. But I'm talking about when we're putting money on the line and we're playing in our fantasy leagues, what are we most likely going to anticipate? That Will Fuller plays a 16-game season, or that Brandin Cooks is the number 1 wide receiver of the Texans? Are we more in line with the idea that Juju Smith-Schuster is not going to be a top 16 wide receiver in the National Football League in comparison to being a bottom feeder in the number wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 conversation? There's no way that in an offense that is led by a potentially future Hall of Famer that we're going to end up seeing a guy like Juju fall off as hard as people think. But either way, that's my thought process. Thank you everybody for watching. If you did enjoy the video, make sure you click the like button down below. I really do appreciate you guys hanging out, commenting down below. So let me know what you guys think about these 3 players. I know it's a very passionate argument. I was about to drop some F-bombs, but I sustained it. I controlled it. And either way, thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.